Welcome to the Washington Heights Church Podcast. We're so glad you're here. Each week, we bring you the latest Sunday message filled with God's Word to help strengthen your faith and deepen your walk with Christ. Whether you're tuning in from home, your commute, or anywhere in between, we're thrilled to have you join our community. So, grab a cup of coffee, find a cozy spot, and let's get started.
So today we are starting a new series entitled Positively Different. And just before we get to that, I want to share a couple of really important things with you that are coming up here very soon. Next weekend is going to be a little bit different. So on Saturday, we have a 5K that's a part of End It. That is an effort to end human trafficking. And then right after that, there's going to be an outdoor night of worship from 7 to 8:30. And there's going to be some fun and games out there, some food trucks and things like that. And I just got to tell you, this is a great opportunity to invite somebody that you know, and they will have a great time there. And it's going to be an awesome time. And then the next day, we're going to have outdoor church service. And when we're outside, we're all together at one time, and that's going to be at 10 a.m. We invite you to bring a lawn chair or whatever it is that would make you comfortable out there. And one of the things we're combining on that day is something we call outdoor baptism. Once a year, we set up a pool outside, and people go public with their faith in Jesus with baptism. And if you'd like to talk about that, we would love to have that conversation with you as well. So next week, 10 o'clock outside on Saturday, End It, and also a night of worship where our amazing musicians and vocalists are going to just bless us as they often do. Pray for good weather. It's been interesting the last few times we've been outside for a service and really cold up on the stage outside. And one other thing that's coming up real soon, if you are investigating faith or you have some questions about faith, there is something called Got Questions, and that's where you can bring that and just have a real safe, open conversation about what does it mean to follow the Jesus of the Bible, and what are we talking about with helping people meet and follow Jesus. And we just encourage you to be a part of that, and you can text the word connect to that number there, and we'll make sure that we get you as a part of that. And I think you'll find that very, very helpful in your journey of just figuring out who is God and what does it mean to belong to Him. So let's turn our attention to the message for today, positively different. And would you agree with me that we live in quite an unusual cultural moment? Right? I mean, we've been through and still are going through a pandemic. There have been some political issues and some racial tensions and all sorts of different issues that have sort of combined in this day. And man, the way that people react to that and respond to that and engage with that is all over the map. And here's what we want to ask, not only today, but in the weeks that follow. How can we live in our cultural moment that reflects the God that we have come to honor and worship today? What does it mean to follow Jesus in a day like this? And I would submit to you that it's got to be positively different. That it's something that in a lot of ways points to the goodness of God and makes that real. But you know, there's some filters that can come over our faith and maybe make it look a little bit different than what it should be. You're all familiar with filters, right? Those are those things on the phones and stuff like that. And they can make you look almost like anything. Well, there was a video that went a little bit viral a couple years ago about two lawyers who were on a Zoom call with a judge, and one of them had a filter on, and he wasn't sure how to take it off. See if you can spot who it is in this video that has the filter on.
Mr. Ponton, I believe you have a filter turned on in the video settings. You might want to take
we're trying to. Can you hear me, Judge?
I can hear you. I think it's a filter.
It is, and I don't know how to remove it. I've got my assistant here. She's trying to, but I'm prepared to go forward with it. I'm here live. I'm not a cat.
I can see that.
Grown men having that conversation. I love this guy in the top right. It's like he wasn't really paying attention, but then when the guy said, "I'm not a cat," he just looked up and started to smile. And I thought that's... Is it possible for faith to have some cultural filters that make it look a little bit different than the way it should be? And I would argue with you that it can. And so how is it that we can possess faith without filters? How can we live positively different in our cultural moment? And I think these issues of faith are really important. I'll just give you one example. This just breaks my heart. Half of high school students walk away from their faith in college. And as sobering as that is, I think the more important question for us to ask is, why is that a reality? And in the studies that have been done, there's a number of them. There are 3 overriding reasons. And a lot of those kids say because of hypocrisy, because of politics, and because of arrogance. Say one thing, do another. Of lining up God and faith just on one side of the political aisle and the other side is evil. And then maybe just living in this world filled with arrogance and coming off, just high and mighty. And a lot of the young kids are saying that just separates me from not necessarily God, but from the experience maybe of even a time like this. And so here's the question that I want us to entertain, not only today, but as we make our way through this series. Am I shaped more by culture or Christ? And in our day and in this cultural moment, there's all kinds of different voices out there, all kinds of different ways that are given to us to move forward and to engage a day like this. Well, what we're going to try to do is understand what it means to factor God into a day like this and live in our cultural moment in a way that is positively different. And so when people look at me, do they see more culture or do they see more kingdom? And I think we obviously know what the answer to that question should be, but we're going to try to break that down and see if maybe there are some ways in which we can apply that to ourselves. And in these weeks, what we're going to do is we're going to track with some experiences in Jesus' life. And today we're going to take a look at an unusual story. Only Luke records it for us, and it's between the time when Jesus was born, and that's Christmas, right? And then there's the 3 years of his public ministry. There's only one time that we get an in-between glimpse, and it's when he is 12 years old. So let's jump into this story. It is loaded with culture, and it's also Jesus helping us to know, how do you factor God in? How do you live within culture and also in a relationship with God? Now, Jesus' parents went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of the Passover, and when he was 12 years old, they went up according to custom. Now, when you see the word custom, that can also be culture. And when the feast was ended, as they were returning, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem. His parents did not know it, but supposing him to be in the group, they went a day's journey, but then they began to search for him among their relatives and acquaintances, and when they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem. Now, there's a part of the story that I think needs a little bit of explanation, because some people might go, and we're going to find out, it took them 3 days to locate Jesus. How does somebody lose their child for 3 days, right? Some of you have lost them for a couple minutes and you're going berserk. How could somebody lose them for 3 days? Now, there was a day before helicopter parenting. I'll just kind of give you that. And culturally speaking, what happened here was when you made this sort of pilgrimage to Jerusalem back in the day, you went in a caravan. And this could be up to 100 people, and often, it was a multi-day journey, and in the beginning of the day, the women and the children would head out first, the men would clean up the camp there, and then meet up at the end of the day. They'd camp again, and then start out the same way the next day. And in that large group, it was people that you knew, and so the kids, in the middle of all of that, my kids are your kids, and your kids are my kids, and so they're with relatives and friends and families. You're not worried, but all of a sudden, Jesus shows up missing, and he's not with anybody, and Mary probably assumed he's with Joseph, and Joseph probably assumed he was with Mary, and he wasn't with either one of them. And so they returned to Jerusalem, searching for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. And all who had heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. And when his parents saw him, they were astonished. And his mother said to him, "Son," and this is going to be that moment that some of us have experienced, that when the stress is over and the emergency has ended and you feel the relief and the joy, now it's time to kill them for putting them through what they just put you through. Son, why have you treated us so? Behold, your father and I have been searching for you in great distress. And all the parents said, Amen. And he went to them and he said to them, why were you looking for me? Did you not know that I must be in my father's house? And they did not understand the saying that he spoke to them. And he went down with them and came to Nazareth and was submissive to them. That's interesting. And his mother treasured up all these things in her heart. And Jesus increased in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. Cultural stuff going on in this story. And there's a detail here that maybe would go by us real easily. When it says that he was 12 years old, for us we might think, well, that's just kind of a random detail in the story. People back then would have known, oh, Luke is on to something very specific here, and he's cluing us in to something that we know in our culture, because every generation that has ever lived in a cultural moment. Well, what's the big deal with being 12 years old? In the Jewish culture, you were a child from birth until you turned 13. At 13, you were an adult. There was no adolescence that we have in our culture and no in between. And so before you turn 13, your primary kinship relationship is with your mom, whether you're a boy or a girl. And then when you turn 13, if you are a boy, you now change that relationship and it shifts, and now your primary allegiance is to your father, who, for all intents and purposes, is going to train you in the family business. You become the apprentice, and there's going to be this baton handing off, and you're just going to do what your dad has done, and that moment shifts at that age. And so Luke's telling us right at that crucial moment, he's right on these, the cusp of this crossroads here. What happens? He says, hey, didn't you know that I had to be in my father's house? I have an earthly father, but I also have a relationship with God the Father from all eternity past. And so there's this kingdom, and then there's also this culture, and it's not that he's disrespecting one to honor the other. And let's not take away from this story that Jesus is telling us, you know what, you can blow off your family, for the sake of God and because you're following God. He honors both. But he also makes it quite clear here that his primary allegiance is to the kingdom. And the kingdom is going to influence how he lives within the culture of his day. And that the values of God and God's heart is what he is going to seek to make real in a world in space and time. And yeah, the culture's not like ours today, but it was a culture. And there are so many moments in which Jesus acted in ways that were not the cultural norms. What was he doing? Was he just trying to press people's buttons? No, he was trying to make real the values of the kingdom within a culture. And sometimes it freaked people out. And on this day, he's freaking his parents out, but he's making clear to them, you know what? Respect you, love you. Remember, he goes and he's submissive to them. But he also says there's a relationship, a vertical relationship. And that is now going to inform his horizontal relationships. And he's going to honor God. He's going to honor his mom and dad. He's going to honor the people in his life. But there is a way in which what is primary influences everything else. So let's talk about some principles that come out of that. First, there's O as our culture, and there's God's kingdom. Right? Everybody lives in space and time and within the context of a culture. This is our cultural moment. And I don't know about you, but I look at our day and I think, wow, there's some unusual things going on. We've never been here before, facing things we've never seen before, and it seems like everybody is losing their minds a lot of the time. So how do we live in our cultural moment, especially trying to factor God into that picture? Our vertical relationship informs our horizontal relationships. What is primary? It's not choosing one versus the other, but it's which one is our primary allegiance and which one will influence all the other relationships that we have. And then also kingdom ways rarely swim along cultural currents. And on this day, Jesus said, I recognize there's a culture, but I had to be here because my vertical relationship with God the Father is primary. I'll go home, I will be submissive, but there's a relationship that is primary. And Luke does this over and over again. This is only the first example in his story. Luke's the one who records for us some unusual stories from the other Gospels, ones that aren't recorded there. And it's the same sort of idea where Jesus acted in ways within a culture that freaked people out because it did not fit into the cultural current of his day. Here's an example. Luke records for us a story about Jesus walking to Jerusalem. He's got a whole entourage with him. And on the way, he's going toward his ultimate purpose in coming. They're going to put him on trial, nail him to a cross. He's going to die and he's going to rise again from the dead. With that looming, he's walking through a city called Jericho, and all of a sudden he stops and he sees a guy named Zacchaeus. Now, if you grew up in church, you know that Zacchaeus was a wee little man, and a wee little man was he. And he climbed up high in a sycamore tree for the Lord he wanted to see. You know what else Zacchaeus was? He was an extortionist tax collector, which in his day would make him the worst of the worst. And walking through Jericho, Jesus stops and invites himself over to Zacchaeus' house. Why would you do that when you have Jerusalem waiting for you and all that you know that's coming your way? It freaked people out. And that guy's life was changed as a result of that. He was expressing the heart of God, the values that God holds in real life, and it didn't fit the culture because most people in that culture would have said, you know what? That person's off limits. They're not worth your time. They basically sold out everything that they know and love. And Jesus goes there. Luke also records for us a story of the Good Samaritan. And that's the story where somebody's lying, bleeding and disabled on the side of the road. And here come the religious leaders, and they make a wide detour around them. Don't want to be bothered. Don't want to deal with that. And then who comes along and helps? And this doesn't have a lot of punch to us, but it's a Samaritan, and that was like the worst enemy that they had within that culture. That'd be like for us in our day. A member of the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, is the hero of the story, and it freaked people out. What is Jesus saying? There can be moments of people that we put in a certain category that might better express the heart of God than those people who know the Bible backwards and forwards. And there were moments in which Jesus didn't fit exactly in the culture of his day. Luke also records for us a story of the prodigal son. The son who says, Dad, I wish you were dead, and I wish you'd give me my inheritance so I can go and live the way I want to. And then the son leaves, and the father waits for him every day and looks for him to come home. And in that culture, that was just not the way that it happened. That son would be dead to you. And that story freaked some people out because he was saying that's the heart of God to people who are far from God. And some people didn't like that. And so there need to be those times and ways in which we don't exactly swim with the current of the culture because our culture does not express the heart of God and the values of God all the time. And so if we just swim with the culture each and every day and way, maybe we need to rethink that and inform our views of how to live, how to think, how to act with God's values and God's heart. But we've been up in the clouds a little bit, right? That's a little bit of principle. Let me kind of bring it down to where we live, right? Because there are a lot of issues of our days that have become very volatile, like lightning rod sort of issues. And it seems like everything is politicized, and because of that, we're all traumatized, by that. And we wonder, well, what do we do? And it sounds like, there's just a lot of ranting and raging about all of that. How do we have God's values inform our thoughts? So I'm going to give you a couple examples of issues in our day, but I believe that they were biblical issues long before they ever became political issues. And my point in this is to demonstrate that not one side of the political aisle may line up with everything that matters to God. So, I am pro-life. I believe in the Bible from beginning to end, you see God as the creator of life, the sustainer of life. And from conception to our very last breath, life is a gift from God and it matters to him. Amen. I also think that there is forgiveness for those who maybe have not lived, with that value. But I believe, and I am pro-life. I also am pro-justice. And that means, that everybody would have a fair shake. I think included with that is being pro-law enforcement and being pro-military, and that we would honor people who stand in harm's way to protect the rest of us and allow us to live the lives that we have. I'm also pro-poor. I think God says a lot about people who are on the fringes. He says a lot about foreigners. And I get that can be a real volatile issue of our day. Here's one example from the book of Ruth, just this tiny little book in the Old Testament, where he says, when you're harvesting your field, leave some around the edges, and whatever falls to the ground, leave it there. Leave it for the people who don't have any. And so I don't believe in a handout, I believe in a hand up. And that's not to say that I'm anti-rich, because you know what, it just isn't about an income or a bank account. It is about what place that holds in our lives. But God has called us to think about, what about the people on the margins? I am pro-equality for every gender and race, every person of whatever color or culture. And are you identifying with a certain movement right now? No, I'm identifying with what God has pictured to us from the very beginning, that every single human being has God-given value. And nobody is better than and nobody is lesser than in terms of their worth before God. And the person who disagrees with me about faith or whatever issue is out there matters just as much to God as I do. And I believe in treating everybody the same way, regardless of their color or culture, and gauging people by the content of their character rather than the color of their skin. That's a dream still worth pursuing. I'm also pro-environment. When you look back in the book of Genesis, when God created this world, he put Adam and Eve in the garden, and he put them there as responsible rulers over God's creation. And so we need to think about that, and we need to understand how it is that we can take good care of what God has given to us. And so if you can come up with a substitute for plastic by the end of the service, that would be awesome, because I don't think, it's doing our world any favors. But again, does God live completely in his values and heart on one side of our culture's political day? I think it's a little bit more mixed than that. So how is it that we can express God's value in this day? It's to have him inform how it is that we're going to live in a day like this. Here's the way the Apostle Paul put it in Romans chapter 12. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind. And so we're just swimming in the direction of our culture. Maybe we need to rethink that. Maybe we need to take that as a little bit of a caution to say, how is it that God would be positively different in a day like this? Carrie Newhoff, who writes a lot, posts a lot of blogs, said this: the church should be an alternative to culture and not a reflection of culture. And not all alternatives are the same. And so how can the alternative be positively different? Back into the story. After 3 days, his parents, found him, Jesus, in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. You know what kind of stands out in that? Here's Jesus in the temple with religious leaders, and he's listening and he's asking questions. If you know anything about the life of Jesus when he went public with his 3 years, he had a lot of conflict and run-in with the religious leaders of his day. These are maybe some of the very same people that are in the temple on that day. And what is he doing? He's listening and he's asking questions. Now, I know there might be some people who push back at this point and say, yeah, but you know what? We got to stand up for what is right and true. I get that. And I've had those conversations too. But I wonder if we have a pattern here that might help us have more influence rather than just making a point in a particular situation. That before we get to, the differences and discuss those and maybe even debate those, that we would listen and that we would ask questions, and then maybe we can engage about the issues. But I wonder if that might transform some of those conversations from things that just raise people's defenses. Well, I told them and I made a point. Well, that's great. And maybe that makes us feel better. But I wonder if the real issue is that we would gain influence, because I think on that day when Jesus is doing that, he was there not to show dominance, but to gain influence. And I wonder if we could do that in our cultural moment. Here's what Jesus said to his disciples near the end of his life. By this, all people will know that you are my disciples if you post a lot of political things and get real angry. If you rant and rave and rage like everybody else about everything under the sun. No, isn't it interesting that the irrefutable proof, according to Jesus, is that we will love one another? And I wonder how many times our culture is starving for a positively different voice. One that is rooted in expressing the values of God that sometimes freaks people out because it doesn't always fit the cultural norms, but one that is positively different. And I might suggest to you that if you're constantly angry all the time and always feel, uptight and always feel the need to engage and always feel the need to argue, I'm going to take a stab at what I think that represents, and you can decide this for yourself. I think that represents fear, not faith. I think we're more afraid. I think it also betrays a lack of trust in a God who is in control, and that somehow we think at the end of the day it's up to me. But the reality is, God is in control. And what would it look like for his people to live like God is in control? To illustrate that, I'm going to give you a sports example because, well, they're the best examples. And some of you were alive for this, but it's one of the most exciting moments in sports that I've ever experienced. The 1980 Winter Olympics. And at that time, America was a nation down on its luck. There were gas lines and high interest rates. Who would want to pay 18% on a mortgage? And that was kind of reality, like swiping a credit card. And the nation was just kind of feeling down. And along came the Olympics, and before they started, we had a hockey team that was made up of college students, because in the Olympics, you can't be a professional, you can only be an amateur. Well, the playing field isn't exactly level, because in the Soviet Union at the time, they didn't pay their players, so they were technically amateurs, but really they were professionals. They played together a long time, and they were dominant. And before the Olympics started, they had an exhibition game at Madison Square Garden in New York, and here is the result. Soviet Icemen deflate USA's amateurs 10-3. And a lot of people went, wow, they scored 3 goals on those guys? That's pretty good. But that score is really bad. And so they thought, well, what are you going to do? We got college kids, they have amateurs, but they're really professionals. What are you going to do? So the Olympics start, and the team actually begins to do really well. And they get to the medal stage where now they're going to play, and who is the second to last game that they have to play? None other than the Soviet Union. We know how this is going to end. I mean, they slaughtered us, before. It was just a demolition. And the game started, and it was a Sunday morning, and I remember standing and not sitting, and we scored, and it was exciting. I'm jumping up and down. Then they scored a couple, and we're behind, like, okay, here it goes. And now it's going to be, straight downhill, and we know where that winds up. And yet they came back. And eventually, surprise, surprise, as Al Michaels say, do you believe in miracles? And here's the thing. That was such an up and down and exciting, adrenaline pumping sort of moment. And then they replayed the game because it was so exciting to so many people, and not everybody got to see it. And so I watched it again. And the experience the second time was very different. I'm sitting down. I got some chips. I got a drink. And when they go up, it's okay. We're going to score, don't worry. We're going to win. And sure enough, We win. And I wonder, in a day like this, could it be that we live like the final score is up for grabs? Or God gets the final word, and he already knows the final score. We are here for the first time in our lives. But when we got here, God was already here. And he's been here before at times when the world gets a little off kilter and gets a little bit scary. God is in control. And one day he'll bring it all to a conclusion of his choosing. And so I wonder how it is that we can live with the kind of confidence that knows that there is a God who's in control. He knows the final score. And as we look at the world in which we live right now, I don't know about you, I've got concerns about a lot of things. And not so much for myself, I think, and I wonder and I worry about the life that my kids are going to be able to live and beyond that. And for many of us, we probably, say in terms of values and things like that, maybe the world's getting darker. But here's a principle, because remember, Jesus called us, he said, you're the light of the world. And here's a principle about darkness and light. The darker it gets, the brighter the light shines. So what would it look like if a group of people who follow Jesus, who was so positively different in his day, and sought to make that real in a day like this, and spoke and lived and engaged our culture with a different voice, a positively different voice? What kind of difference could that make in a day like this, in our cultural moment? Would you pray with me? Lord Jesus, thank you for goodness and grace to us all along the way. Thank you for the many, many ways in which you bless these lives of ours, every bit of it undeserved and yet so freely given. And God, may we not just be people who receive your good gifts. May we be people who want to reflect the heart, the character, the nature of the God who has given them. And help us to make the most of our day, of this cultural moment. And help us to make an impact for your sake. And at the end of the day, may we know, God, that you are in control. And because we belong to you in a relationship with you, we win because you win. But in the day-to-day lives that we live, God, help us to make a difference, have an influence for your sake in a way that just offers the hope that is found in you and in you alone. Lead us in that direction, God, for your name's sake, we ask and pray. Amen.
We hope you enjoyed today's message. If you found this sermon meaningful, please subscribe, rate, and leave a review. Your support helps us reach more people and spread the word. Stay connected with us throughout the week by following us on social media at Washington Heights Church on Facebook and Instagram, and by visiting our website at WHC.faith. For more information and additional resources, check out the podcast description below. Thank you for joining us. See you next week.